You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hello, I'm Ted, human rights lawyer, criminal law professor, and host of the podcast TED Talks. You're listening to Teka Teka Ted, the legal commentary segment of Teka Teka News, where we answer questions about law and government. In this episode, we ask, what can Senator Leila de Lima do to hold accountable those who caused her unjust detention and her prosecution?
Glorious day, beginning of my vindication.
On May 12, a Muntinlupa court acquitted Leila de Lima of another drug charge. The former senator, who is on her 6th year of detention, is now one step closer to freedom and vindication. Assuming her final case gets dismissed, the next question is, ganun na lang ba yun? What can Leila de Lima do to hold accountable those who actually brought her to jail, filed suit against her, prosecuted her, and now are probably getting away? The obvious remedy is malicious prosecution. It's not a criminal case. It's a civil case for damages. And here, the thinking is that for someone who has been dragged to court unfairly and maliciously, then the remedy here is simply to, give him money, right, for the damage that has been brought upon him. The elements here, of course, would be that the prosecution is false. The basis for the prosecution is false, but that the prosecution has been brought maliciously, meaning deliberately, intentionally. The person who sued knows very well that there is no basis for the prosecution, but nonetheless proceeds with the prosecution. The second element is that the accused has been acquitted, meaning there is a court finding that there really is no basis for the prosecution. And therefore, there is now what is called in law a malicious prosecution. So after the acquittal, the former accused can now sue for damages. And here, the former accused would have to, come up with an amount that he or she thinks would approximate the damage that was done because of the suit. Probably he or she would try to quantify in money terms the damage caused by maybe being brought to jail, being, brought to court, being put on the stand, cross-examined. What would go into damages here would also include, for example, loss of business opportunities, maybe even loss of employment, the embarrassment, shame, humiliation, which we in law would call moral damages, right? There is also the element of anxiety and fear and mental health issues that are caused by the malicious prosecution. So all of these damages, the former accused who is now acquitted will now have to quantify and tell the court, look, this is what was done to me, and this is how much I should be compensated in monetary terms. So the consequences of filing malicious prosecution, the burden is on the plaintiff, the former accused. And so now it has to be proven. The judgment in the criminal case, that's easily proven because the document can be presented. What's not so easily proven would be the amount of damages, right? Because here, the plaintiff would have to present proof that, okay, if it's loss of business opportunity, if it's loss of employment, they will have to prove that. What's a little bit harder would be the moral damages, right? The humiliation, embarrassment, the sleepless nights that was caused by this. But then, assuming that the plaintiff is able to prove all of these, then the court will now have to decide if the amount of damages being asked by the plaintiff is actually reasonable. So the court has discretion to say, all right, you've proven your case, you've proven that yes, damage was caused to you rather, but I think the amount is unreasonable. So that's one drawback to malicious prosecution because it's now entirely the burden of the plaintiff who used to be the accused, right? There's one last point that needs to be made about malicious prosecution. Simply because it is a civil case, it costs more. Under existing rules of the Supreme Court, in order to file a civil case that asks for damages, the plaintiff must pay upfront a percentage of the cost of the damages that he or she is asking for. So assuming, let's say, he asks for 15 million because that's what he wants, right? Even if he can't prove it. Before he files the case, before the court accepts the court will ask for a percentage. Let's assume 10% conservatively of 15 million, right? So that's already 1.5 million upfront. He pays that. And then he gets 100,000 in damages. Lugi pa siya, di ba? Let's say he's indigent. He says he's entitled to 15 million. And of course, he asks that, he not be made to pay upfront because he's indigent. The court says, okay, the filing fees and the docket fees will be a first lien on the judgment. LIEN. Like it's a lawyer's term. Essentially for saying we claim a percentage of the award because that's where we'll take the docket fees. That's why, it's not really that effective in a sense, no? And so, yes, it is available, but it's really not the the most, well, I would say, relevant or responsive remedy to a situation where a person like Leila de Lima has been dragged to jail for 6 years now on what is now being confirmed are trump-up charges.
So where does this leave the detained former senator? More on this after a quick break.
And so the question we need to ask is, aside from malicious prosecution, what else can she do? We need to remember that this played out because a former president started it all with a speech, right?
And here is a senator complaining when one day I will tell you that her driver herself, who was her lover, was the one also collecting money for her during the campaign. Here is an immoral woman flaunting...
Sexist statements were made, which played on media, right? And people started talking about it on social media. People started to make fun of her, to destroy basically her reputation, not just for being supposedly involved in drugs, but for being this kind of person, right? And her colleagues in Congress, right? I mean, both houses. I don't know if there is any situation where a sitting senator became the subject of such a congressional investigation where the essentially members of Congress were salivating for the next piece of trivia, right? Talking about someone's sex life, alleged sex video, talking about affairs. And so, that was distasteful, to put it charitably, right? And then, of course, she was a senator at the time. She had been elected. She was sitting in the Senate. And because there is a separation of two houses, Congress is composed of the Senate and the House. What should have been the response of her own chamber, right? The Senate itself. I mean, to my mind, it was totally unacceptable for the Senate to not tell the House. That's at the very least unparliamentary conduct. There should have been parliamentary courtesy extended here at the very least. And if there was, in fact, any investigation to be done, then let the appropriate law enforcement justice agencies take care of it. Why should Congress be involved, especially if this involved a sitting member of the Senate?
But instead of doing any of this, her colleagues in the Senate ousted her from the chairmanship of the Justice Panel. She was leading a probe into Duterte's drug war at the time.
I move that the chairmanship and members of the Committee on Justice be declared vacant.
That is the motion.
So the question now would be, do we just forget that, right? Do we just forget that, 6 years ago, this was done to her? Can she sue those people involved in creating this entire environment, this scenario? I really do not see any direct remedy that she can sue. she can file at the moment. Malicious prosecution, yes, but only against those who filed cases against her. This would not cover, for example, members of Congress. This would not cover the former president, right? And so what would she have against them, right? And if she cannot go against these people and hold them accountable, what hope do we have to stop impunity against other lesser known citizens, right? Those who are not Leila de Lima. So I think that question, difficult though it is, because at this time we may not have very clear answers, needs to be asked. Because, we cannot forget that this was done to her. And she's not the only one. I'm sure there are others who have been treated in the same way, right? And so, unfortunately, she becomes effectively the symbol. She becomes the poster woman for this entire issue of impunity being continued.
Whether Leila de Lima will be able to hold the former president and his allies liable remains a question. But it doesn't have to end there. They can be held accountable in other ways.
I'll give you an example of accountability rather than liability. Marcos himself, the father, was never held criminally liable because he was in exile. And then he died in exile. So no criminal cases were filed against him directly for the atrocities during martial law. Imelda, of course, there are cases filed against her. She has a conviction pending against her. And so that's liability, because liability is defined by what law you supposedly violated and what proof can be shown that you violated the law. It was so serious that they had to create a crime for what they did. Plunder did not exist until after 86. That was so serious. They had to create a crime and call it a different name because of what they did, right? And so, of course, Marcos could not be sued for plunder. Plunder did not exist as a crime at that time, right? And so he died in exile. So he cannot be held liable anymore, right? But could he be held accountable? Could he be held responsible? Congress passed a compensation law to compensate the victims of martial law, right? And the PCGG's recovery attempts of the ill-gotten wealth were used to fund that claim. So that's holding them accountable, right? So that people do not forget that they did this.
Again, I'm Ted Te, Puma Podcast. This episode was produced by Belia Perez Rubio. It was edited by Pidoy Blanco. Follow Teka Teka News and Te Talks wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.